As a child, Ben Mitchell saw firsthand how financial hardship could destroy lives. A friend's family lost their home overnight, victims of a banking system that prioritized profits over people. That moment shaped him, planting the belief that finance should serve individuals, not just corporations. Initially, Ben considered law as a way to fight economic injustice, but a brief internship disillusioned him. Change, he realized, wouldn't come from lawsuits. It had to start within the system itself. Determined, he set his sights on banking, but on his own terms. At the Palace Hotel, guests applauded as Perry Bergen took the podium to present Ben Mitchell with the Banker of the Year award. Sitting at the head table, Ben smiled politely, though he'd rather be anywhere else. Publicity always made him uneasy, but he couldn't deny that the recognition felt rewarding, especially as it validated the years of hard work he'd put into making Community First Bank a reality. At least it was great advertising for the bank. Ben had been refining his idea for a bank since his college days. Rather than compete for corporate accounts, he envisioned a bank focused on serving individuals and families. "We invest in people" was the bank's slogan. Most people thought retail banking was a thing of the past. When Ben first pitched the idea as a college project, his professor gave him a failing grade, predicting it would never work. Even Perry, his finance classmate and friend, had doubts. Everyone except his target audience dismissed the plan. But in a world that had grown increasingly impersonal, customers appreciated the personal service Ben offered. Small business loans and personal lines of credit flourished, with shockingly low default rates. Ben's bank quickly turned a profit, growing faster than anyone expected. Now, industry analysts were predicting that a large competitor would soon try to buy him out. Though a lucrative offer might have been tempting, Ben was committed to his vision and had no interest in selling. As Perry continued his speech, his wife passed him a cup of coffee. Ben smiled, kissed her cheek in thanks, and took a sip. Coffee was practically his trademark. He was rarely without a mug in hand. Of course, Ben's journey wasn't without its challenges, Perry continued. He faced immense obstacles along the way. Ben, listening quietly, thought to himself, "They don't know the half of it." Ben's life had been shaped by three pivotal decisions. The first came when he was a teenager. He decided to give up alcohol entirely. His mother's alcoholism had profoundly impacted his childhood. She started drinking in moderation, but over the years, it escalated. By the time Ben was in middle school, it had become a constant in their home. He vividly remembered a moment when she threw food in his face after he didn't finish his lunch. His father, desperate to help, intervened countless times, but nothing worked. Despite his best efforts to protect Ben, his mother refused to acknowledge her problem. Eventually, Ben's father accepted that only she could save herself. After she disappeared for days, only to be found in a homeless shelter, Ben's father filed for divorce. Ben, however, never forgot the day he saw his mother in a hospital, dying from cirrhosis. That experience solidified his resolve never to touch alcohol. Coffee, on the other hand, became his drink of choice, always within reach. Ben's second key decision was to follow in his father's footsteps and become a banker. Despite his rebellious teenage years and his initial disdain for the banking industry, he came to realize the value of his father's work. After a tense Christmas break during his first year of college, Ben's father took him on a drive through the city's working-class neighborhoods. He showed Ben how their bank had helped people buy homes, cars, and even start businesses. His father's integrity and commitment to making a difference in people's lives changed Ben's perspective. Ben switched his major to business, focusing on banking and finance, and began to see his father not just as a parent, but as a mentor and someone with a deep, quiet passion for his work. That connection grew stronger in the year before Ben's father passed away from a heart attack. Though devastated by the loss, Ben found comfort in the final year of closeness they shared. At his father's funeral, Ben discovered that he was the beneficiary of a generous life insurance policy. With this, he was able to finish college and launch his banking career, starting his own bank, Community First. Ben's third decision, made years earlier, had been to create a bank that truly put people first. The life insurance money his father left behind became the seed capital for that dream. And in doing so, Ben was able to honor the lessons his father had taught him about integrity, service, and making a difference. Ben made an important decision during his sophomore year of high school when he signed up for a community service project. There, he met Elizabeth Pearson, From the moment he saw her, he was taken aback by her beauty. It was a feeling that left him speechless, and when she caught him staring, he blushed, unsure of what to say. Later, she approached him and asked why he was staring. In a moment of nervous honesty, Ben blurted out that he thought she was the girl he might marry someday. To his surprise, Elizabeth responded by saying she had thought the same thing about him. From that moment on, they became inseparable. Their relationship was initially a source of amusement for their classmates. But over time, it became clear to everyone that Ben and Elizabeth were serious. Ben's father, though concerned about his son focusing so early on one person, was eventually won over by Elizabeth's character. She was kind, smart, and responsible. Ben's father even took the time to discuss responsible relationships with him. Relieved to find out that Elizabeth and Ben had agreed to wait until marriage. The couple planned to attend college together, and after graduation, they would marry. But everything changed with the sudden death of Ben's father. Ben returned home to handle the funeral and family matters, while Elizabeth continued with her studies. She wanted to drop out to support him, but Ben insisted she stay in school. Weeks passed, and Elizabeth began socializing more on campus, which led to men showing interest in her. However, she remained committed to Ben. When Ben finally visited her at college, he noticed a change. Elizabeth, while missing him, seemed distant and quiet. After a tense dinner, Ben asked her what was wrong, and she confessed that she had been scared by his father's sudden death. The thought of losing him, too, shook her deeply, and it led her to push Ben to be more intimate, even though they had promised to wait. In a moment of intense emotion, they broke their promise and slept together. Though they were relieved afterward, they also realized they hadn't used protection, leading to a few weeks of nervousness before Elizabeth's period returned. Ben had missed a semester of school and struggled to catch up. He had to attend summer classes to graduate with Elizabeth. Their wedding took place 3 days after graduation. Ben, kissing his bride, whispered that marrying her had been the best decision of his life. After graduation, Ben decided to gain some experience working at a traditional bank before starting his own. His strong academic record and his father's connections landed him a position as a trainee manager at a large local bank. He worked hard, but he couldn't wait to bring his dream of opening his own bank to life. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found a teaching job in an elementary school in a low-income area. Her patience and dedication made her a favorite with her students. Despite their modest income, they lived frugally, saving for Ben's future bank instead of buying a house. They had their share of challenges. Elizabeth had a fear of doctors, and when she needed her first gynecological exam after their wedding, Ben tried to comfort her. But when the results came back showing something suspicious, they both feared the worst. The doctor's diagnosis was even worse than they imagined: ovarian cancer. Ben was terrified, but the doctor assured them that surgery could remove the disease before it spread. As they prepared for her surgery, Ben was shaken by the reality that life was unpredictable. Despite their plans and dreams, they now had to face a new, unplanned challenge together. Ben felt Elizabeth's tension as they faced her battle with cancer. The closer her surgery approached, the more he was gripped by fear, but Elizabeth seemed strangely calm. Instead of being overwhelmed, she found peace. While Ben struggled to keep it together, she quietly explained that after everything she'd been through, there was nothing left to fear. "The worst is already here," she said, accepting her fate. The surgery was initially a success, and the oncologist was optimistic. "I think we removed everything," he told Ben. "There's a good chance she'll remain cancer-free." But that hope quickly crumbled. Follow-up tests showed the cancer had spread to her liver, and chemotherapy only made her weaker without slowing the disease. Ben's life became a blur of work, hospital visits, and caring for Elizabeth, leaving him little time for anything else. Guilt gnawed at him as he watched her suffer, feeling helpless in the face of her illness. After yet another round of chemo, the doctor suggested a clinical trial at Stanford that might offer new hope. Ben eagerly accepted the idea, but Elizabeth refused. She was done with hospitals and treatments. "I just want to go home," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. Ben's heart broke, but he agreed to respect her wishes. With the support of a hospice nurse, Elizabeth spent her final days at home. The nurse's visits gave Ben brief breaks to go to work, but the pain of watching Elizabeth fade was unbearable. One afternoon, the nurse called. "It's time," she said. Ben rushed home, finding Elizabeth in bed, her red hair spread around her like a halo. She smiled weakly as he sat beside her. "You are the best husband," she whispered. "I wouldn't change a thing." Ben, tears streaming down his face, struggled to find words. How can I live without you? He choked out. Elizabeth's face became serious. I want you to promise me 2 things, she said softly. First, make your dream come true. Open that bank you've always talked about. I believe in you. I promise, Ben replied, struggling to hold himself together. The second thing, she continued, her voice steady, I want you to find someone else to love. Someone who will take care of you when I can't. Ben recoiled, horrified. I can't. I'll never be able to do that. You will, she said firmly. When you meet her, give her all the love you gave me. Promise me. Torn apart, Ben finally agreed. I promise. Moments later, the hospice nurse gently placed a hand on his shoulder. It's time, she said. Ben kissed his wife one last time, then stepped out into the painful reality of life without her. Grief-stricken but determined, Ben quit his job and began the long-awaited journey to open his own bank. He reached out to Perry Bergen, a longtime friend, and together they used Ben's inheritance to launch Community First Bank, CFB. They chose the name to reflect their mission, to serve and support the local community. CFB quickly stood out from the competition. While big banks moved to digital services, Ben focused on small branches in working-class neighborhoods, often converting abandoned properties into affordable banking spaces. He offered loans with fair rates, challenging the predatory practices of payday lenders and other high-interest companies. As word spread, CFB gained a loyal following, especially among small businesses in need of working capital. Despite the challenges, CFB slowly grew, and after 4 years, it was generating steady profits. Ben bought a home, the one he had always planned to share with Elizabeth. His grief remained, but time dulled the sharpest edges. A year after Elizabeth's death, his friends began to push him back into the dating scene. But Ben couldn't bring himself to open his heart to anyone else. Then, 4 years after Elizabeth's death, Ben's routine began to shift. Instead of staying in an office, he worked out of his branches, rotating each week between them. It allowed him to stay connected to both employees and customers. And during one of these weeks, he finally noticed something that made him rethink his future. The next chapter of his life had begun. Ben was working on some calculations when a flash on the wall caught his attention. A silent alarm had been triggered at one of his branches. A robbery was underway. He quickly accessed the security cameras and saw the would-be thief standing by the cash register. Scanning the area for accomplices, he saw none and switched to the exterior camera. The only vehicle in the parking lot was an old pickup truck. Ben zoomed in on the robbery. The cashier handed the robber a bag of cash, and he immediately ran out the door. As the man rushed across the parking lot, he got into the truck, only to freeze when he saw Ben sitting in the passenger seat. Who the hell are you? The robber demanded, surprised. I'm Ben Mitchell. This is my bank you're trying to rob, Ben replied calmly. The man reached for his jacket pocket. I don't care who you are. Get out of my truck or else. Ben stayed composed. Not until you listen to me. The robber glared at him and barked. I told you. Get out now before something bad happens. Ben looked the man over. You don't have a tool, do you? The robber hesitated, then slumped in defeat. No, he muttered. Ben pointed to the bag of money. How much were you hoping to get? I needed $30,000, the man replied, his face weary. I was hoping it would cover the mortgage and get me by until I find work. Ben shook his head. There's less than $5,000 in that bag. It's the limit we set for each register. And if you open it, there's a dye bomb inside that will explode. The man scoffed. What kind of robber am I? He muttered. Have you done this before? Ben asked. The man sighed. I lost my job 6 months ago. Then my wife got sick and everything fell apart. I guess I just got desperate. Ben studied him for a moment, then opened the truck door. Come with me. The man, defeated, followed Ben back into the bank. Employees were stunned when they saw their boss walking in with the man who had just tried to rob them. Ben sat down at a table and gestured for the robber to sit across from him. That someone get me a loan form, Ben instructed. He turned to the man. Here's the deal. You give me back the money and I'll lend you what you need to get back on your feet. You can pay me back once you're stable. The robber looked incredulous. Why are you doing this? You know I don't have a job, and I just tried to rob you. Ben smiled as he filled out the loan form. If I report the robbery, the bank will have to close for the rest of the day, and I'll lose money. Plus, I'd have to deal with paperwork. But if I lend you the money and you pay me back, I make a small profit. I think you're worth the risk. He slid the paper across the table. Do we have a deal? The man looked at the document, his eyes widening. Wait, you're lending me $40,000? I only wanted $30,000. I figured you might need a little extra. If you don't use it all, you can return the rest. The man, still in disbelief, took the pen and signed the loan agreement. God bless you, Mr. Mitchell, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. The story spread quickly throughout the bank, and by the end of the day, Ben's business partner, Perry, called him. What were you thinking? We'll never see that money again? Ben sighed. Maybe, maybe not. It just felt like the right thing to do. Please don't make these decisions without talking to me first, Perry pleaded. The next day, a client who had filmed the entire incident uploaded it to YouTube. When Ben arrived at work, a TV crew was waiting to interview him. By the evening, the story had gone viral. The next morning, USA Today picked up the story, and soon after, Ben was contacted by Good Morning America. During the live interview, a local company offered the former robber a job. If Ben Mitchell's willing to give him a chance, we can too, the company's spokesperson said, prompting cheers from the audience. The media frenzy continued, with the New York Times calling Ben the face of compassionate capitalism. Though he hadn't wanted the attention, it brought a huge boost to Community First Bank. Perry was thrilled by the surge in customers and deposits, but he never brought up his initial concerns again. A month later, one of Ben's employees told him that a woman wanted to speak with him. She says she's a reporter. Ben sighed. I thought this was over. Can't she come back later? The employee looked at him oddly. You really should see her. Surprised, Ben agreed. When the door opened, he was stunned. Standing in front of him was a striking woman, tall, dark-haired, and with a captivating presence. Her features weren't perfect, but they were arresting. A slight bend in her nose only added to her beauty, making her face more expressive. Ben hadn't realized he was staring until he quickly stood up, embarrassed. Sorry about the office. Let me shake your hand. The woman, undeterred, smiled and sat down. I'm Scylla Devereaux, Mr. Mitchell. I'm actually not a reporter. I'm writing a book called Metamorphoses of American Banking in the 21st Century. From what I've read, your bank would be a great case study. Ben was intrigued. They talked for hours, and he learned that Scylla had an MBA from Wharton and had worked in consulting before deciding to write. They discussed their backgrounds, and Ben shared the story of how Community First Bank came to be. When the bank closed for the night, Scylla apologized. I didn't realize how late it is. Would you like to continue this over dinner or coffee? I'd love to, but I already have plans, she added, smiling. How about another time? Ben readily agreed, and they set up another meeting. Their connection deepened as they continued talking, and Scylla moved Ben with her own story of overcoming an abusive first marriage. As the evening ended, she kissed him on the cheek. This has been wonderful, she said, and Ben couldn't agree more. They both looked forward to their next meeting. Ben had long since stopped denying the growing attraction he felt for Scylla. She was unlike the women he'd met after losing Elizabeth. Intelligent, engaging, with a sharp wit and a striking beauty that could rival magazine models. Their dinners had been effortless, their chemistry undeniable, and when she asked to see his house one evening, he was thrilled. As they walked through the door, he proudly showed her around. The house, now more of a symbol of his success, felt even more significant in that moment. He hung up her coat, then began to explain the features of the house. But before he knew it, Scylla turned to him, kissed him fiercely, and pressed her body close to his. He stood there, momentarily stunned, before pulling her back into another passionate kiss, his feelings for her suddenly unleashed in a way he hadn't expected. What followed was a night neither of them would forget, filled with an intensity neither had anticipated. The next morning, Ben woke to find Scylla peacefully sleeping beside him, looking as flawless as ever. They exchanged soft words, each confessing how deeply they felt for one another. It was clear now, what started as an interview had transformed into something much more. From then on, they were inseparable. Ben introduced her to his friends, took her around the city, and no longer kept their relationship hidden. His friends, especially Perry, were relieved to see Ben finally moving on from the pain of his past. But some of the women who'd pushed him to date again seemed less than thrilled to see him so happy, their envy evident. 6 months into their relationship, Ben proposed to Scylla. She agreed without hesitation, though she insisted on a small, simple wedding in their garden, with just Perry and his wife Frances as witnesses. Life seemed perfect. Ben had everything he'd once thought was impossible. love, success, and the prospect of a bright future. But everything changed one evening at a prestigious event where Ben was named Banker of the Year. As he walked to the podium, a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. His vision distorted, his heart raced, and soon the world around him seemed to crumble. His surroundings turned surreal. Figures distorted into grotesque shapes, and the podium itself became a living entity, pulsating and twisting in his hands. Panic set in, and he collapsed, overwhelmed by the terrifying visions that consumed him. Ben was rushed to the hospital, and Gina Esposito, a nurse, was assigned to care for him. At first, she thought little of it, but when she learned his identity, her perspective shifted. She'd heard of Benjamin Mitchell, the man who'd been in the news for a remarkable act of compassion. But now, seeing him comatose and unstable, she was faced with the reality of his condition. His physical tests were all normal, but his mind was unraveling, and she couldn't help but feel sympathy for him. Gina's thoughts quickly turned to her own struggles, how life had taken a turn she hadn't expected. After a painful breakup and an unplanned pregnancy, she'd been forced to start over, living with her mother and raising her daughter, Angela. Despite her hardships, she found comfort in her daughter's smile. Still, this new patient, this VIP, who was now under her care, would require more than just medical attention. It would take patience and understanding to navigate the complexities of his mental state. As Gina observed Ben, she couldn't help but wonder what had led to his mental breakdown, a breakdown that seemed as sudden as it was extreme. The hospital staff had done everything they could, but what came next was uncertain. Ben's future was now in the hands of those who cared for him, and the mysterious forces at play within his mind. Gina checked the viewing window and saw that the patient, Ben, was now sitting quietly against the wall. He didn't appear aggressive, so she decided to approach him. She asked a nurse to call Harold and entered the room to check on Ben. He glanced up but stayed still, and Gina maintained her distance, observing him closely. When he finally spoke, he seemed confused and asked who she was. She introduced herself as Nurse Esposito and asked if there was anything she could help with. To her surprise, he requested a cup of coffee. After some hesitation, Gina agreed and instructed the nurse to bring it. When she handed it to him, Ben took a sip and immediately grimaced, finding it terrible, which made Gina laugh. He commented about how much he missed good coffee, and Gina felt a small sense of relief at his improved mood. Eventually, Ben asked where he was. Gina informed him that he was in Longview Mental Hospital after a breakdown. He seemed puzzled, recalling a banquet but unsure what happened afterward, mentioning nightmares. His confusion deepened when he asked what day it was. Gina explained it was Monday, and Ben expressed disbelief that he had been out of it for the entire weekend, wondering what was happening to him. Before she could respond, Dr. Adenauer, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, entered. He greeted Ben, who slowly recognized him. The doctor confirmed that Ben's memory was intact, which was a good sign. When Ben pressed about what was wrong with him, Dr. Adenauer explained that although they hadn't made a definitive diagnosis, they had ruled out physical causes like brain tumors, stroke, or seizures. Ben was healthy, but the episode at the banquet remained unexplained. The doctor reassured him that if it was an isolated incident, they would treat it as such. But if it happened again, they would explore possible treatments. Ben questioned whether he needed to stay at the hospital, and Dr. Adenauer suggested it would be wise for monitoring, both to ensure safety and to observe his recovery. Ben reluctantly accepted this, though he didn't know how long he would need to stay. After Dr. Adenauer left, he told Gina that Ben was an important patient, and she was to monitor him closely with no other duties. She was tasked with documenting his thoughts, behaviors, and any signs of relapse. Gina was surprised by the responsibility, as she had never been assigned a patient in such a direct, constant manner before, but she agreed. Later, Gina returned to Ben's room, where he greeted her sarcastically, questioning if she was his babysitter. She ignored the remark and tried to make the best of the situation. She handed him a Starbucks coffee, which immediately softened his attitude. He thanked her for the gesture, commenting on how much he missed decent coffee. Ben eventually agreed to cooperate, asking if they were going to do typical psychological tests. Instead of diving into tests, Gina chose to ask him about the events leading up to his breakdown at the banquet. She was interested in understanding his emotions, actions, and interactions before the episode occurred. At dinner that night, Gina shared her new assignment with her family. Her brother Marco, a detective, was intrigued by the case and tried to learn more about Ben. Though Gina was hesitant to discuss patient details, Marco managed to find a video online showing Ben's breakdown at the banquet. The footage shocked them all, showing Ben losing control in front of a crowd. Marco speculated that Ben was likely on pills, but Gina dismissed the idea, explaining that extensive tests had shown he was clean. She noted that many others had eaten the same food at the banquet without any issues. Marco, unconvinced, speculated further, but Gina was firm in her stance that it was a medical case, not a police one. Later, Marco showed Gina another video of Ben helping a bank robber by approving a loan instead of stopping the crime. While it seemed bizarre, it added to the complexity of Ben's character. It was a surprising act of kindness that contradicted his breakdown. The next day, Gina returned to Ben's room, determined to establish a connection with him. He greeted her with sarcasm again, but she ignored it and handed him coffee. He softened, thanking her, and the two started to have a more cooperative exchange. Gina decided to focus on learning about the moments leading up to Ben's breakdown, hoping to uncover more about his state of mind before his episode. Gina was still uncertain about how she was supposed to monitor Ben's mental state and what she could really accomplish. But as she spent more time with him, she began to see glimmers of his personality beyond the initial hostility, and she hoped they could work through this difficult time together. Gina continued her questioning, trying to get as much information as possible, though nothing stood out as unusual at first. She pressed on, making sure not to miss anything important. Eventually, she asked Ben to describe the episode he had experienced, hoping that the details would help Dr. Adenauer make a diagnosis. Ben hesitated, but Gina explained that sharing more might be helpful. As he began to describe what had happened, Gina had trouble keeping her professional distance. Unlike many patients who didn't realize anything was wrong with them, Ben seemed acutely aware of his abnormal behavior. He spoke of the frightening sensations he'd had, hearing a woman scream, but tasting a bitter flavor, and seeing a blue color while running his hand over a carpet. The experience had terrified him. Gina explained that this was likely a form of synesthesia, where the senses become mixed up and the brain misinterprets them. While Ben was still disturbed by the memory, hearing it had a name seemed to comfort him, though he didn't want to delve deeper into it. Gina, sensing his discomfort, suggested they take a break and have lunch. As they ate, Gina tried to find a neutral topic to discuss, eventually deciding to focus on Ben's past to learn more about him. She asked him about his family, interests, and anything that might provide insight into the root of his breakdown. At first, Gina feared they might run out of things to talk about, but once they started, the conversation flowed. She wasn't just looking for facts. She was trying to understand the deeper layers of Ben's personality. What she learned surprised her. Ben didn't come from the background she had imagined for a successful banker. His father had been a middle manager, and his mother struggled with alcoholism, which deeply affected Ben. Gina could understand why he was so careful about avoiding alcohol. She also saw that, despite his mother's struggles, Ben had become closer to his father, showing resilience rather than bitterness. Just as Ben was about to talk about his ex-wife, Elizabeth, a nurse interrupted to remind Gina about the shift change. She promised they'd continue the conversation the next day and quickly left to get some rest. The following morning, Gina brought Ben his favorite Starbucks coffee, and he seemed genuinely pleased to see her and the gesture. As they continued their talks, Ben opened up about his past relationships, and Gina found herself unexpectedly moved by his story. By the time Ben left for his session with Dr. Adenauer, Gina had to shake off the emotions that had started to bubble up. The next morning, as they sat together, Ben asked her what she thought of Dr. Adenauer. Gina didn't want to get into her personal feelings about the doctor's detached approach, so she gave a diplomatic answer. Ben wasn't convinced, and then he turned the tables, asking Gina about herself. At first, Gina tried to keep things professional, but then she decided to share her story with him. Ben asked thoughtful questions, especially about her ex-boyfriend and the pregnancy. His interest seemed genuine, and Gina found herself revealing more than she'd planned, particularly about how her ex had abandoned her when she became pregnant. Ben seemed genuinely outraged by this, and their conversation took on a deeper emotional tone. Just as she was telling him about her daughter, a woman walked in, a striking figure who caught Gina off guard. Ben immediately recognized her. She was his wife, Scylla. Ben stood up excitedly, but Gina quickly intervened, sensing the situation could spiral out of control. She reminded Ben to stay calm, and he reluctantly sat back down. Scylla, though polite, seemed distant. She briefly introduced herself to Gina, stating that she was aware of the hospital's policy to have staff present with Ben at all times. Scylla gave a small nod, accepting this without much resistance. The conversation between Ben and Scylla was filled with formal pleasantries. Scylla mentioned the chaos at the bank after the banquet incident, which seemed to agitate Ben. Despite his excitement at seeing her, he also expressed some disappointment, particularly about her delayed visit. Scylla tried to smooth things over by offering him a gift, a cup of Starbucks coffee and sugar packets. She quickly kissed him on the cheek, apologized for having to leave, and hurried out the door, leaving Ben staring at the coffee in his hands, confused. Gina observed the entire interaction. While Ben had clearly been happy to see Scylla, she sensed some unresolved tension between them. She couldn't help but wonder how much of this emotional complexity was contributing to Ben's breakdown. As she watched Scylla leave, she made a mental note to follow up on the situation. There was more to this story than met the eye. Gina couldn't shake the disappointment she felt after Ben's wife Scylla left so abruptly. Ben's obvious sadness lingered, and despite trying to reassure him about the coffee and his wife's beauty, he remained distant. It was clear that Scylla's departure had hit him hard. A nurse interrupted their moment, reminding Gina it was time for her shift change. As she left, Gina's frustration boiled over. How could Scylla be so indifferent to Ben's suffering? If she were in Ben's place, Gina thought, her husband would be at her side every day, not vanishing after 5 minutes. That evening, her brother Marco's teasing about getting too involved with her patient only fueled her anger. She argued with him about Scylla's lack of concern, but Marco just shrugged it off, saying she didn't know the full story. Gina dismissed his remarks, but the next morning, she couldn't stop herself from arriving early at the hospital, Starbucks cup in hand for Ben. However, as she approached the floor, the night nurse warned her that Ben had suffered another severe episode. Gina rushed to the viewing window and saw Ben, restrained in a straitjacket, clearly in distress. After learning that the episode started after a shift change, Gina tried to keep her emotions in check as the nurse detailed how Ben had been delirious and disoriented, possibly losing his sight. He'd calmed down only after a heavy dose of diazepam. Gina entered the room and, after some hesitation, carefully removed Ben from his restraints. He collapsed into her lap, sobbing like a child. And for the first time, Gina saw a patient who fully understood the gravity of his condition. It broke her heart. As she comforted him, a nurse entered with a syringe for Ben's medication, clozapine, an antipsychotic meant to stabilize him. Despite his earlier distress, Ben's energy seemed completely drained. After he fell asleep, Gina checked his medical records and was disturbed by the change in his diagnosis. What had seemed like an acute episode was now being described as a persistent disorder. The more she read, the more uneasy she became. She knew Ben's condition was serious, but the lack of communication with his wife was unacceptable. Despite it not being her responsibility, she called Scylla to inform her of Ben's condition. Scylla's indifferent response, promising to visit when her work permits, left Gina infuriated. That night, still fuming, Gina asked Marco to look into Scylla's background. Despite his reluctance, he agreed, sensing something wasn't right. 2 days later, when Gina returned to work, she found Ben more subdued than ever. He complained of feeling mentally sluggish from the medication, but his questions about when it would end were tinged with resignation. Gina tried to distract him by asking about his work. He seemed disinterested at first, but as he shared a story about his father and their trips, his tone changed. Passion returned to his voice, and Gina was surprised at how his energy picked up as he spoke. Her initial curiosity about banking grew into a genuine interest, as Ben's enthusiasm was contagious. For the first time in a while, Gina saw a glimmer of the person he had been before his illness. By the end of the day, their conversation had stretched well beyond lunch, and Gina found herself engaged in a topic she'd once dismissed as dull. But seeing Ben's thoughts and emotions sharpen gave her hope that he was beginning to fight his way back. Gina was about to speak with Ben when Scylla Mitchell entered, accompanied by a man Gina didn't recognize. She immediately felt a twinge of suspicion. The man, looking around Ben's age but with a bit more weight and thinning hair, stood by Scylla. Ben, clearly excited to see his wife, greeted them both. He introduced the man as Perry Bergen, his business partner. As they began discussing business matters, Scylla quickly steered the conversation to more urgent issues. She explained that the bank, under Ben's absence, had struggled without a CEO, and that the latest developments made it clear Ben wouldn't be returning to his role anytime soon. Perry added that there were critical reports and contracts that still needed Ben's attention, which, according to him, hadn't yet been officially addressed. Ben, confused and upset, tried to argue, but Scylla smoothly interrupted. She reassured him that no one was removing him as CEO, but they'd been granted power of attorney by Judge Gray to handle his affairs temporarily while he recovered. Ben seemed stunned by this revelation, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the news. The weight of it all clearly wore him down, and he quietly accepted the situation. Gina, wanting to comfort him, noticed the second shift nurse signaling her, prompting her to leave. She promised Ben she'd return in the morning, but as she watched them leave, she couldn't help feeling enraged at how coldly the situation had been handled. It felt like Scylla and Perry were seizing control without a second thought. Later that evening, as Gina walked through the parking lot, she overheard voices arguing in the shadows. Curious, she edged closer and froze when she recognized Scylla and Perry's voices. They were arguing about their control over the situation, with Perry reassuring Scylla that it was over now that Ben was out of the picture. Gina's suspicions were confirmed. Scylla and Perry were having an affair, and their conversations seemed to suggest they had been scheming behind Ben's back. Fuming, Gina rushed home and confronted her brother Marco, who had been looking into Scylla's background. She needed answers, and Marco had found some unsettling details. Scylla had previously been married to a banker in Miami, but was kicked out after being caught cheating. Marco revealed that Scylla had fled to avoid retaliation from her husband's connections, eventually landing in Philadelphia. Gina was horrified, and everything about Scylla's behavior now seemed more calculated. Still angry, Gina resolved to keep a close eye on Ben's wife. She wasn't sure what to make of the situation, but something about Scylla's cold, manipulative nature didn't sit right with her. The next morning, before her shift, Gina received a call from Marco. Perry Bergen had been found dead from a suspected heart attack. Shocked, Gina realized she would have to tell Ben, though she dreaded breaking such devastating news to him. When Gina entered Ben's room, he was sitting quietly, his expression distant. She gently informed him of Perry's death, and the news seemed to shatter what little composure Ben had left. His grief was raw, and he began to spiral into panic and confusion. Gina stayed by his side, trying to calm him, even as he writhed in distress. His erratic behavior escalated, but Gina's soothing presence seemed to bring him some comfort. She held him, stroked his back, and sang softly, trying to ease his suffering. Eventually, Ben fell into an exhausted sleep. Gina, emotionally drained, carefully left his side and locked the door behind her. The nurse on duty noticed her distress and pointed out the smudged makeup on Gina's face. She hadn't realized how deeply the situation had affected her. As the evening wore on, she kept an eye on Ben, relieved when he finally stirred. Ben stirred, still groggy, his eyes unfocused. Then, slowly, recognition crossed his face, followed by a wave of despair. He recalled the previous episode, the strange sensations, the confusion. It had felt like everything was spiraling out of control and he couldn't stop it. Gina squeezed his hand gently, trying to reassure him. She explained that this episode, though unsettling, was different. It had been shorter, and he had managed to recover on his own without anyone needing to restrain him. To her, that seemed like progress, but Ben couldn't see it. He was frustrated, thinking that his mind had failed him again, even though this time it hadn't been as terrifying. He had felt a glimmer of control, a small victory amidst the chaos. Gina was quietly relieved. This episode had been less severe than the others, and she couldn't help but feel that Ben was improving. She kept her thoughts to herself as her shift ended, and she stayed behind to review his medical records, hoping to find an explanation. But everything seemed normal. No unusual test results, no clear answers. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That evening, when she returned home, Marco was waiting for her. He wasn't in a joking mood. He wanted to know what had happened with Ben. Gina explained the latest episode, emphasizing that she felt it was a good sign that Ben had recovered so quickly. But Marco wasn't convinced. He suggested that Ben might be using something illicit, connecting the symptoms to substance use. Gina, however, was adamant. The episode had been different this time, less severe, less chaotic. Marco pressed her on the specifics of Ben's tests. Gina explained that Ben had undergone a urine test after his first episode, per federal guidelines. But Marco pointed out that pills could leave the system quickly, within hours in some cases. He asked when the tests had been conducted, and Gina recalled that they'd been done too late, well after Ben's first episode. Marco suggested that this could explain why the pills hadn't shown up. Gina dismissed the idea at first, but then remembered that only one person had given Ben something, his wife, Scylla. She had brought him a coffee from Starbucks, which might have been tampered with. Marco was quick to make a connection, suggesting the sugar packets could be the source of the problem. Gina, now on edge, knew something was off, but was unsure how to proceed. Marco, ever cautious, warned her to be careful and reminded her that they didn't have proof, only suspicions. He urged her to keep observing, but not to jump to conclusions. The next day, Gina entered work with a heavy heart, unsure of how to handle Ben. She didn't want to stir up his emotions by raising her suspicions, especially about Scylla. She knew the news about Perry's death had already caused him enough pain. But the more she thought about it, the more paranoid she became. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, Gina was caught off guard when the nurse on duty instructed her to take Ben to Dr. Adenar's office on the 6th floor. This was highly unusual. Patients were never sent there. Alarm bells went off in Gina's head. To buy herself some time, she asked the nurse to prepare Ben's wheelchair while she went to the bathroom. Once inside, she quickly called Marco. She explained the strange request and how it didn't fit the hospital's usual procedures. Marco, sounding unconcerned, didn't understand why she was so worried. He dismissed her fears, unable to leave his own responsibilities. Gina, frustrated and anxious, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was convinced something was wrong. Despite Marco's indifference, Gina tried to steady herself. She knew she had to be strong for Ben, but the unease gnawed at her. When she returned to Ben, she found the wheelchair waiting and did her best to explain the situation. Ben, confused and a bit alarmed, asked about the visit to Dr. Adenar's office. Gina reassured him, saying it was just a precaution to keep him safe. Ben accepted her explanation, though he was clearly uncertain. As they headed to the appointment, Gina's mind raced with questions. What was really going on behind the scenes? And how much longer could she protect Ben from whatever dark forces were at play? When the elevator reached the 6th floor, Gina rolled Ben's wheelchair into the unfamiliar space. It was her first time on the administrative floor, and she immediately noticed the thick carpet that made pushing the chair difficult. She couldn't help but think that the floor wasn't meant for patients, a thought that set her on edge. As they neared the end of the hallway, she was surprised to see Ed, the large orderly, open the double doors to Dr. Adenauer's office. "Ed, what are you doing here?" she asked, confused. "I'm here to make sure there are no disturbances," he replied with a smirk, stepping aside to let her through. Inside, Gina spotted Dr. Adenauer speaking with Scylla Mitchell on a spacious balcony. The situation felt off, but she didn't know why. The doctor greeted them warmly and directed her to bring Ben over so they could enjoy the afternoon sun together. Gina rolled him toward the balcony where Scylla quickly embraced him. The hug seemed distant, not like a loving gesture, but she kept her thoughts to herself. As the group settled at a small table, Gina stood awkwardly by the entrance while Ed lingered nearby. Dr. Adenauer, with an air of authority, suggested they have drinks. Ben refused alcohol, and Adenauer quickly reassured him, offering coffee and tea instead. When the doctor turned to Gina and told her to bring the drinks, she was taken aback. She didn't like being treated like a waitress, but she decided to stay composed and followed his instructions. In the small kitchen, Gina prepared the drinks, still puzzled by the situation. What were they celebrating? She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As she filled the cups, her eyes landed on the sugar packets neatly arranged on the saucers. A chilling thought struck her. What if the sugar had been tampered with? But before she could dwell on it, Dr. Adenauer's voice called her back. She brought the tray out, and Scylla immediately arranged the cups. The doctor thanked her and told her she could leave, but Gina hesitated. She didn't want to leave Ben alone in such an uncomfortable situation, but Adenauer's expression grew cold and demanding. Reluctantly, she closed the door behind her and walked away, feeling a growing sense of dread. Inside, Ben was visibly nervous, unsure of what was happening. He asked Dr. Adenauer and Scylla why he was there, but they brushed off his concerns, suggesting he relax and enjoy the sun. As they sipped their drinks, Adenauer began talking about his vision for Longview Hospital and his accomplishments. But Ben didn't see how it related to him or Scylla. Scylla cut in, explaining that the hospital was facing severe financial issues, which Adenauer was downplaying. She hinted that the solution could come from a change in leadership at Community First Bank, CFB. Ben was confused and tried to push back, but Scylla continued, implying that if the current management at CFB were out of the picture, the bank could lend the hospital the money it needed. Then Scylla's words took a darker turn. She admitted to manipulating Perry Bergen into helping her with her plans. But when he grew too difficult to control, she had to eliminate him. Ben's shock grew as Scylla revealed that Adenauer had helped her in her efforts. His mind raced, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Before Ben could react further, Scylla casually explained that the only way to ensure the success of their plans was for him to remain mentally incapacitated. She had sedated his coffee, and soon he would have another episode, one severe enough for him to fall from the balcony and die. Ben panicked, but before he could resist, he felt the effects of the pills taking hold. As his body began to weaken, Ed, the orderly, stepped forward to restrain him. Ben struggled and screamed, but the pills was already taking its toll. Suddenly, the door flew open and Gina rushed back inside. "What are you doing to him?" she shouted. She saw Ed looming over Ben and, without thinking, confronted him. Scylla smirked. "Ah, the nurse. I wondered when you'd show up. Looks like you've gotten too involved with my husband." Adenauer, stunned by Gina's sudden appearance, froze. Scylla, however, remained calm. She taunted Gina, suggesting that her heroic attempt to save Ben would make for a tragic story. She wanted to turn Gina into a martyr, making her death part of their twisted plan. As the tension escalated, Adenauer, visibly disturbed by the turn of events, began to lose control. His face twisted with panic, and he screamed, flailing around as if trying to escape an invisible force. In a sudden frenzy, he climbed onto the balcony railing and fell to his death, screaming all the way down. Gina stood in shock, realizing what had just happened. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I didn't know it would happen like this." She had swapped the sugar packets, replacing the sedated one with one intended for the doctor. But it seemed the damage had already been done. Ben slumped in his chair, groaning as another episode began. Ed, enraged, pulled out a knife and advanced on Gina. In a panic, she screamed for him to stop. But before Ed could reach her, Marco burst into the room, tool drawn, shouting for him to freeze. The large man turned to confront his new adversary, but Marco fired his tool multiple times. The bullets seemed ineffective. Marco stepped back, frustrated, and tripped over the wheelchair, crashing to the floor with a groan. He moaned once before falling completely silent. Scylla was the first to react, quickly trying to make her way toward the door. However, Gina was quick to grab her wrist, preventing her escape. Realizing there was no way out, Scylla composed herself, adjusting her clothing. She then attempted to turn the tables, accusing Gina of sedating Dr. Adenauer and attempting to frame her. Gina immediately shot back, denying the claim, and instead pointing out that Scylla had tried to pills Ben and that Ed had attacked her. Scylla, unfazed, spun a story about Ed being a hospital employee who was merely trying to protect the doctor. She also claimed that Ben, who had been under Dr. Adenauer's care, was mentally unstable. But Gina was prepared. She had a phone with her that had recorded everything. She revealed the recording to the room, hoping it would be enough to prove Scylla's guilt. The phone captured the entire conversation, exposing the conspiracy. Scylla, despite being cornered, remained calm and composed. While Marco moved in to cuff her, Gina hurried to check on Ben. He was still slumped in his chair, head down. She gently took his hand and quietly asked him what had happened. Ben looked up, confused, and slowly seemed to regain his composure. It took a moment before the recognition hit him. The flashback, triggered by stress, had clouded his memory. But now he remembered. Scylla had murdered Perry, and she had tried to do the same to him. She had mixed something into his drink to harm him. Rather than responding with shock or fear, Gina smiled at him, her expression full of pride. Ben had overcome his flashback. He had snapped out of it quickly. This was a huge step forward in his recovery. Gina embraced him with joy, knowing he was on the path to healing. 2 weeks later, Gina came home from work to find her older brother there. She embraced him tightly, calling him her hero, a sentiment that he took with a mixture of modesty and pride. She expressed her deep gratitude, explaining that if he hadn't returned when he did, she might not have made it out of the situation alive. Her brother revealed that he had overheard her phone call, and, hearing the fear in her voice, he came back to help. It was a decision he would never regret. With tears of gratitude in her eyes, Gina hugged him again, her appreciation for him evident. After dinner, Gina suggested her young daughter, Angela, go play in her room so that she could speak with her brother privately about the latest developments in the case. Marco, eager to fill her in, shared that Scylla had been indicted by a grand jury. However, she had hired a prominent lawyer and pleaded not guilty, hoping to escape the consequences of her actions. Gina was outraged, but Marco remained unfazed. He knew the case was strong. They had the recording, and Scylla couldn't dispute it. However, her lawyer was trying to argue that the conversation between her and Dr. Adenauer was a privileged one. While Marco had never heard of such a defense, he was confident that there was plenty of other evidence to convict her. He shared his thoughts with a hint of irony. He almost felt sympathy for Scylla, he said. If only she weren't so manipulative. She had schemed for years, but her plans always fell apart. She had married Ben, hoping his position would give her access to wealth and luxury. But when Ben turned down the bank group's offer, she decided to have him declared insane with the help of Dr. Adenauer. She then seduced Perry Bergen to get him to push the takeover forward once Ben was out of the picture. Marco explained that Bergen had known about most of the plot, though not the plan to liquidate Ben. Gina was stunned, but Marco continued. Bergen had always been jealous of Ben, and when Scylla started to flirt with him, he believed she was in love with him. He went along with the plan to eliminate Ben, thinking he would eventually get everything Ben had, the title and Ben's wife. But after Bergen became CEO, things started to unravel. He became greedy, wanting not only Ben's title, but also his wife. Scylla, afraid of their relationship becoming public and the questions that would arise, decided she had to get rid of him too. She thought that once Bergen was out of the picture, she would have full control and could do whatever she wanted with the bank. Gina reminded Marco that Bergen's death had been ruled a heart attack, but Marco explained that the initial autopsy hadn't raised any red flags. However, when the medical examiner examined his heart more closely, it showed signs of a myocardial infarction. Now, with a court order, the DA was having Bergen's body exhumed to investigate further. Marco suspected that Scylla had poisoned him with a substance that could trigger a heart attack. Gina recalled hearing rumors that digitalis might have been the cause. Marco agreed, saying it wasn't surprising, given Bergen's poor health. Marco speculated that Scylla had poisoned Bergen during their time together at his house. After spending the night with him, Bergen likely fell asleep, giving her the opportunity to administer the lethal dose. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. She left the house, and it appeared as if nothing was amiss. The whole situation was chilling, cold, calculated, and cruel. Gina shuddered at the thought of it all, realizing just how far Scylla had gone to get what she wanted. Their mother, who had been listening to the conversation, was still confused. She asked who Scylla had been involved with, Perry Bergen or Dr. Adenauer. Gina quickly answered, suggesting that Scylla was likely involved with both, as she would do anything to get what she wanted. Marco agreed, mentioning that while Scylla refused to answer questions about her relationship with Adenauer, they couldn't know for sure since he was dead. However, it was clear that she had leverage over him, using his financial struggles to get his help in getting Ben declared mentally ill. Once Bergen became a problem, it seemed Adenauer had also helped her with him. They were still reviewing the hospital records, but Marco was sure they would find proof. Marco then explained that when Bank Group pulled out of the acquisition, Scylla saw Ben as an obstacle and decided to eliminate him. By this time, Adenauer was so involved that he had no choice but to follow through. He compared Scylla's plan to cancer, growing and spreading until it was uncontrollable. He admitted that Gina had played a pivotal role in stopping her. Their mother, proud of them both, embraced them. Just as they were enjoying the moment, the doorbell rang. Ben Mitchell entered holding a large box of calla lilies to thank Gina. He expressed his gratitude, though Marco joked that he hadn't brought any flowers for him. They all laughed, and Angela, Gina's daughter, came down the stairs, curious about the noise. When introduced to Ben, she asked if he was the one her mom loved, which made Gina blush. Ben responded warmly, telling Angela that he was indeed crazy about her mom, leaving everyone smiling.